So I'd like to talk a little bit about what should be included in a partnership agreement. Now, I mentioned in the last video that I have a little process that I take people through where I tell them these are the things that should be in a partnership agreement, and here's some ideas about how you might want to address those things, how you want to cover them. And I'd like to just give you a general idea now about what ought to be in a partnership agreement and why those things need to be there. So I'm going to do this quickly. I'm not going to go through all the options. That's what we do in the meetings. So if you're interested in that process, reach out to me. The website is in the section below, and you can see where the website is and contact information from me. I have a process that's very inexpensive where we sit down with all the partners and we talk through the provisions that need to be in a partnership agreement and the provisions you want to add, and I'll give you some ideas and recommendations and help people work through agreements, and then we draft a memo and you've got a partnership agreement. So excuse me for using notes here because I don't want to forget anything, but let me give you some notion of the things that need to be included in your partnership agreement. The first thing that needs to be there is the initial contribution of the partners. So Joe Blow and I are starting a business together. We're going to be partners. I'm putting up $5,000. Joe only has $1,000, but he's going to work hard for the first 6 months and get everything running, and I'm not going to work. I'm going to just keep going on my job, and he's going to work and not be paid, and that'll be his offset for that $4,000. We need to define that. We need to say, I put in 5, he put in 1 plus labor. Okay, so you want to define everybody's contribution. If everybody's putting in $10,000, we want to say that. If there's some, other form of contribution, we want to say that. So we want to get that really clearly laid out. The next thing we want to define clearly in our partnership agreement is the distribution of equity or ownership. Is this a 50-50 partnership? If so, let's say it. Let's say that I'm a 50% and Joe is a 50%. It's a 50-50 equal partnership. Let's get that laid out. A lot of the disputes I deal with when people call me for mediation have to do with that very thing. They say, well, we started out and it seemed like equal, but he's not doing his job and I think it ought to be 60-40, and pretty soon people are in a fight. If you have it laid out in a document that both parties or all parties, if you have more than 2 partners in the business, if that's all defined and laid out, that dispute isn't going to come up because you have it in writing, it's etched in stone, nobody's going to dispute it. So I highly recommend that provision. What do you do if additional capital is required? So I put 5, Joe puts in 1,000 and works. 2 years from now, we find out that we're not going as well as we thought we should, and I've got to put in another $10,000. Do I get more equity, or is that a loan, or how do we treat additional capital? And that's something we really want to talk about and define in there so that when it comes up, and it will, and most new businesses have various rounds of money that they need to raise, so when it comes up that they need additional capital, how are we going to treat that? Okay, the next thing I want to include is how do we make decisions? So there's Joe and I. Do I make all the decisions regarding finances and Joe makes all the decisions regarding marketing? Or are all the decisions made by both of us in a vote? How is that process in the business? That'll prevent us from getting in a dispute that, I'm never part of things. You made that decision without talking to me. I was excluded from that. Or, hey, that's my job and you're interfering with it. It cuts out all that stuff. So it's good to get defined how are decisions going to be made in the business. Okay? What happens if there's a tie? What if I say, I think we need to expand the business. There's a building across the street for sale. I think we ought to buy it. You say, definitely not. I think the business is perfect the way it is. I don't want to expand. How do we break a tie? Do we flip a coin? Do we get a Ouija board? Does my vote outweigh your vote if there's a tie? Or do we get a third party, or do we mediate it? How are ties decided? In a 50-50 partnership, you need a method for breaking ties, and if you document it and put it in writing, it'll help you. What are the partner's responsibilities? Who does what? What is Joe going to be responsible for? This is something that comes up a lot. People call me all the time and they say, look, I'm doing all the work. I do the sales, I do the marketing, I do the books, I do all the administration, I take care of the customers. He's not doing anything. And then I talk to Joe and I find out that his job is maintenance, and he says, well, nothing broke this month, so I didn't have anything to do. And he won't let me do anything because he always interferes and, that kind of stuff. So it's good to define what the responsibilities of the partners are. I like to add something about how disputes are handled. So if we disagree, not just breaking ties on votes, but if there's a dispute, if we get angry at each other, how do we decide that? Is that we just let it go, or do we vote it and then go to that process? Or do we have a clause in there that says if there's a major decision we can't agree and it gets to a dispute where we're actually in sort of a hostile position, we go to mediation? And I've seen that in a lot of partnership agreements. So we need to put something in there about how we handle disagreement. And it may be just, we take turns letting go every other month. If it's an odd number month, I let go, and the even number month, you let go, or, something like that. It can be however you agree. Then we have to talk about how we're going to get paid. Are we going to take a salary plus distribution of profit? Are we just going to say we're each going to take a flat amount, $500 a month for the first year, and then after that we're going to just split profit evenly? Or you're doing most of the work, so we're going to split the profit 60-40? How are we going to deal with money? How are we going to be paid? How do we decide when people get a raise? How do we distribute profit? That all needs to be decided. Then you have the life events that happen. Death. What happens if one of us dies? Does Joe's wife become my new business partner, and I have to deal with her, and she never liked me in the first place, and now I've got a business partner that's hostile? What happens? What happens if a business partner dies? Do we fund that with life insurance, or do we just say, well, sorry, Charlie, now whoever survives owns the whole business? What do you do? What about disability? What if a partner can't work for a year or 2 years? They're in a serious accident. They can't work. Do you keep paying them? Or do you get angry and say, I'm not paying you another dime? Or how do you deal with that? Having it figured out in your partnership agreement beats the heck out of going to court and litigating and spending tens of thousands of dollars and fighting for 5 or 6 years and ruining the business, the friendship, the relationships. Everything goes down the drain. Figure it out in advance, and I can give you ideas about how to handle those things. Then there's abandonment. What do I do if Joe just takes off? He has a midlife crisis, buys a sports car, and decides he's going to travel the country, and he's not going to work anymore. What happens? He still owns the business. His name is still on the lease. What happens? So after 6 months, does the whole business become mine? Do I quit paying him? It's a good idea to define what do we do with a partner who abandons his interest, and how do we define that abandonment? And then what about a voluntary exit? That's the term for that is a buyout. What if I just want to retire and I don't want to work anymore? Do you buy me out? And what are the terms? Can I just sell my interest to anybody, or do I have to have your approval? Or are you the only one that can buy me out? How does that work? It's a good idea to define it. And part of that is, how do we value the business? Do we just, get an appraisal? Now, that sounds like a good idea. Bring in a business guy, get an appraisal. What if we don't agree on the appraisal? Then what? Get another appraisal. Now we have two, and one's high and one's low, and one wants the high one and one wants the low one. Whatever. How do we work that out? How do we decide? Well, get a third appraisal, and then we'll take the one in the middle. Well, depending on the nature of the business, those appraisals are not cheap. They have to go in and really audit the books, go deep on everything, really analyze. An appraisal can cost $20,000, and that may not be practical. So, you get 3 appraisals, you spend $60,000 on a business that's worth $100,000. That doesn't make sense. So how can we value the business? I have some good ideas for you on that as well. The other thing is, what about policies? Are we going to have a policy that we're never going to hire relatives because that always makes for a problem if we get a lot of family members? Or are we going to say any spend over $500 needs the approval of both of us? Are we going to say that if the business expands east of the Mississippi, that is your territory, and everything west of the Mississippi will be both of ours? Or what? I mean, people come up with all kinds of notions around operating restrictions and provisions, and you may have your own. And as we talk through this stuff, things will come up. What about use of vehicles? What about spending money for personal stuff? What about taking the company car home? What about travel? Does the spouse go? I mean, just things that may be a problem. We should talk about and get into your partnership agreement. So what we do is we talk through these provisions. I give you some ideas. You say, this is how we want to handle it. We draft an agreement that says, here's each provision. Here's how we decided to handle each thing. You guys sign it. That becomes part of your business records. And if anything were to come up, you at least have something you can hang your hat on. It's binding. It's legal. You guys agreed to it. You signed it. And that makes it ethical and legal and binding. So, yeah, it's great if you can have a lawyer do all that stuff, but that can, cost you a few $1,000s. This process is much less expensive than that. We have a couple of meetings. I take you through each provision, give you some ideas. You tell me how you would like to handle it. Then we draw up a memorandum of understanding. You guys sign it, and you're covered. So, reach out to me. Let's set you up with the meetings with your partner, and let's get this done so you're covered. Don't leave yourself wide open. Gosh, I see heartbreaking stuff every day that can be avoided with a very simple memorandum of understanding. Thanks. See you soon.